All right.
Hello, everybody. We're back with Zoomcast number 4, and I'm Byron Belitzos, and we're with Evolving Souls community here. And folks, this is a very special day for me to have Professor Ted Peters with us, who has become a friend of mine. And I'll give you a brief bio of Ted. And having introduced Ted, then we'll have a little bit of prayer time. Ted Peters is a professor emeritus of systematic theology at the Graduate Theological Union at UC Berkeley out here in California. Ted has many affiliations. He's also a Lutheran pastor. He ministers currently to a congregation. But he's especially known, at least to me, for his work in the academic dialogue of science and theology. But his interests are wide-ranging, including ethics and history, contemporary culture, spirituality. And to his credit, Ted is one of the few rare academics who's open to a public dialogue about the Urantia Revelation. And this is kind of a first. So thanks to you, Ted. And we're going to say a little bit more about Ted's work, but let's have a little bit of prayer time now that most are with us. Just like to ask everybody to close their eyes and envision the grace that is always surrounding us and the fact that we are loved by our divine Father and Mother, as we put it in the Urantia book, that Christ did come and dwell with us and still does and always will. And we are blessed sons and daughters of God. So let's just take a moment to look within and be in silence. Okay, thank you, everybody, and thank you for coming on with us. I see a lot of you logging in now. Welcome to all of you. Just to say a little bit more about Ted, Ted is a prolific author, and I don't even know where to start to summarize all of his books, his many writings. He's also an editor in the field of academic theology. And he, in addition to, his specialty, many specialties, I should say, he's the editor of Theology and Science journal, and it is not inaccessible to we lay people to look that up on the internet and read what theologians are thinking about, which is really the theme for us today, to find out what a very current and innovative theologian is thinking and writing about. A long time ago, I audited a couple of courses of Ted's. And as a result, later on, he was on a panel, and I want to invite all of you to look up the our YouTube channel, and look for the Cosmology and Urantia book video, and see what Ted had to say. Back then, he was sympathetic with the discussion, but he also had some criticisms of Cosmology and the Urantia book. And I just want to point to the fact that Ted has a very important new book out called God in Cosmic History that we're going to talk about. And I'm told, Ted, that your magnum opus is God, the World's Future, a systematic theology for a new era, from Fortress Press. And this is, I guess, used as a comprehensive textbook around the country. Is that correct?
Oh, that's correct. A number of seminaries use this for the Master of Divinity students. The third edition came out in 2015. I had to take much more seriously those postmodern critics,
Ah, yes, the postmoderns, and same with the Urantia people, which I don't know if you have considered this idea that the Urantia Revelation is not postmodern; it's modernist. And
Well, I could actually see that. I don't want to surrender the achievements of modernity too quickly, especially reason. I kind of,
yes,
I kind of rely on reason, so I don't want to give that one up too quickly, even though the postmodernists are really concerned in a passionate way about justice and justice for those who get marginalized, and that's a good, healthy addition.
they've also though brought this kind of skepticism to the discussion of facts and truth, and they don't even like the word truth. They prefer something like truthiness. And, but what were the critics saying about your work, and why? What did you have to?
Oh, I've been reading my critics on this new book, God and Cosmic History, and as you can tell, this is a meta narrative, right? We're going to deal with the history of the entire cosmos, and that's kind of big. What my critics, who have a postmodern bent, are saying is, but gee, Ted, aren't you forgetting about the local and the particular? After all, we don't want to just kind of squash what is meaningful to Native Americans or other marginalized groups or victims of colonialization. The risk of any meta narrative is that it purveys a worldview that belongs to those who are in power, and just the very concept of a worldview or a meta narrative has this kind of oppressive or domineering sense for leaving out those who have particular niches of meaning. And let me just say, I understand that. I think any really good theology or philosophy has to present a dialectic between the value of the immediate and the particular and the local in dialogue with the cosmic and the whole, if it is going to be healthy. So I'm going to accept that criticism, but at the same time, I'm not going to give up rationality or the need to construct a worldview that puts everything in reality in relationship to our God who is gracious.
Well said. Thanks, Ted. You know, it's ironic that the marginalized groups, Native Americans, for example, they have a meta-narrative at the heart of their own religion, and they have their own sacred theology. And so here the postmodernists are defending them against on their behalf, justice for these oppressed groups. But those oppressed groups stood for a meta-narrative in their traditions. So I find that to be ironic.
Well, I have a hunch that most traditional cultures that have coherence and cohesion over time are going to have a meta-narrative of one type or another. And so when cultures clash, in part, it's a clash of worldviews. And one of my critics tells a story about Native Americans, the Oglala tribe in South Dakota, which currently were confronted with a number of scientists who wanted to study the universe on their land. And it appeared as though we're going to have a clash of cultures. But when the Amerindians got into a real engagement with the scientists and saw what the scientists were doing with regard to physical cosmology, they actually had sort of a rebirth of appreciation for their own relationship to the land. So a kind of synthesis between the two meta-narratives developed. And in a sense, that's a story that ends well. And finally, if there is a clash between one meta-narrative and another, well, maybe a little dialogue wouldn't hurt.
You know, maybe that's what our future will be, that the meta-narratives of different groups will rise and converge, and we'll have a grand meta-narrative for the planet that is inclusive of other, which we are. I mean, interreligious dialogue is moving in that direction, would you say?
Oh, yes, but I don't want to be too optimistic too quickly because we've got friends, you and I both have friends who call themselves pluralists. Somehow or other, we have to sit in a society shared with uh, uh, incorrigible, separate worldviews side by side and respect them as being other. Well, that's irrational because you got to have a meta narrative that even includes, the plurality of local narratives. So I would say that maybe it's a process of recognizing the pluralism, leaping to the next meta narrative, then recognizing it's one among many meta narratives and leaping again. So it might be an ongoing process, this attempt to construct a single worldview in which everything is meaningful within it.
Can we say that this is what you've attempted to do in your work, particularly?
This is what I attempt to do, but I'm not. I'm not basing this upon a final revelation. What I think of in terms of the scripture and the story of God's relationship to the creation is that these are symbols upon which we rationally construct this meta-narrative, and we try to include science. But a symbol like the new creation or the kingdom of God or something like that suggests the construction of a meta-narrative. It doesn't dictate it, so to speak. So that's why it's an ongoing process, while at the same time, I'm hoping that it will reference God as the ultimate reality.
Which is why you put it right there in the title in big letters, God, the future,
Right.
the world's future. I was very impressed with how you do that in your titles to reestablish the centrality of God, our creator God, right there on your book covers. Well, let's get more into that as to how and this is the kind of question that probably your students are too shy to ask because it sounds too naive, but how would you characterize the meta narrative to the extent that you have one? I know that you qualified that earlier, that you're working with symbols and you're suggesting, but if you were asked to say that, how would you encapsulate that?
Well, in this new book, God in Cosmic History, I do more questioning than I do answering. I try to break open the unnecessarily limited worldview of modern science. And I absolutely love modern science, so I don't want to suggest there's anything wrong with it. It's just that in order for the modern scientist to provide workable explanations, he or she looks solely for efficient causes. It's called methodological naturalism. The problem arises when the worldview that is characterized by a system of natural causes, the closed causal nexus, is thought to be the only reality. Then you don't ask about what's beyond it. And what is beyond it could be God. I mean, I can't prove that, but I can certainly say that if we could crack open the closed causal nexus presupposed by, the modern scientific worldview, then maybe we could ask the God question again. And that's before I offer any answers. I'd like to get the question back out there in public debate.
Are you encouraged by the dialogue right now with the scientific community? Certainly there are academics that are working in science and theology, and those are your colleagues, but outside of that circle, are you encouraged or discouraged by the prospects of dialogue at this point?
Well, I'm both encouraged and discouraged. I'm encouraged because some really smart people, Nobel Prize winning caliber scientists, are very serious about posing the God question and recognizing the contributions of science, while at the same time recognizing the need for other sources of knowledge that could raise the question of God, human meaning, what goes on in your and my human subjectivity, even the evolving soul, of course. On the other hand, the scientific community, you know, the editors of Scientific American or those of other major communications, do not want to include any openness towards things that could be supernatural or extra material in character. And some of this is backed up by atheists. I don't want to say, hey, that's a bugaboo hiding behind every bush or anything like that. But there is enough of the influence of that ideology, a materialist ideology, within the scientific community that, yeah, there are a lot of scientists who don't want us theologians invited to their barbecues.
What would you, what do you, how do you think, you know, the fact that the Urantia book, which is a, you know, a unified, coherent discourse that links science, religion, philosophy, history in a modernist kind of language, you know, it's not had been a very big hit with universities, with academics, with seminaries. What advice, you know, on this subject of a meta-narrative do you have for our community in getting this across, since most of us believe this is a very serviceable meta-narrative, particularly linking science, philosophy, religion, that the world needs now? I mean, what, you know, since you're working in that area too, what do you have words of encouragement or words of warning for Urantia folks?
Well, I think I've got two things to say, Byron. And the first one is, you know, don't shy away from the grand worldview meta-narrative, because our inner soul actually needs to feel that it is connected with ultimate reality, total reality. And that's where we go, really, for reality, is into the soul and then out the other end to the cosmos. So whatever you do, don't shave off the grand scope,
Yes,
of the Urantia Revelation and the broadness, comprehensiveness of the meta-narrative. On the other hand, you've got two problems or challenges to face. And the first one is there does really exist a marketplace in which groups are trying to sell their own meta-narratives. So yours is one among many. Well, but that's true of mine as well. Even if my meta-narrative incorporates a great deal of natural science, it's still only one among many. And those postmodern friends of ours we were talking about before are going to say, well, they're all human constructions. So there's no way of buying reality. You know, we're only going to buy one human construction among others. Now, I don't believe that, but I do recognize that in the religious marketplace or the philosophical marketplace, there are a lot of meta-narratives on sale. And I would say your task as a Urantian and mine as a Lutheran Christian is to make a pitch and try to demonstrate that this meta-narrative includes more of human experience and more of human meaning than the competitors out there. Maybe in that process, there might be a merging of horizons and an overlap and a convergence. All of these things would be good. But there's no way for us to return to the pre-modern era and by authority or fiat declare that this meta-narrative is the right one and everyone else is wrong. That's probably not an option that either you or I have.
it raises the question of revelation and faith in relationship to revelation. And, you know, the claim of revelation. which is one thing that postmodernity cannot stand to hear about, because that trumps, sorry, bad pun, everything else. If we have revelation here, it supersedes, by definition, all the other claims, if I got that right. And so then in relationship to that is our faith in that revelation. So there's the question of faith here. I wonder what you think about this term revelation and whether it has a place, and should we speak in terms of that these days?
Yes, we definitely need to speak in terms of revelation for lots of reasons. But let me tell you a little bit about my theory of revelation, and then I'm going to ask you to what extent that fits or does not fit your grasp of the Urantia Revelation. I, as a Lutheran, believe in sola scriptura, that the Bible is really a record of the interaction between human history and God. And in that sense, it is a revelation. I do not believe that God dictated a worldview or a meta-narrative. Rather, what the Bible reports are concrete historical events that Christians believe are transparent to the eternal God of grace. And so when we read the Bible, we're reading that mixture of God's action and human reaction. We're not reading a divinely bestowed blueprint of the furniture and curtains in heaven. So that's why St. Anselm told us that faith needs to have intellectual reflection in order to pursue understanding. So I think of the Bible as symbolic discourse in my attempt to construct a worldview as rational discourse that interprets it. So now, Byron, let me ask you, as you think about the Urantia Revelation, do you think similarly, or do you think that perhaps the Urantia book really does have an already rationally codified blueprint of what the universe looks like and how God has actually set about planning for your and my soul evolution, leading all the way finally to paradise?
You like to ask the big questions. That's a
You
big.
started it, Byron.
Yeah, I think I did, but I don't think I've ever had anybody pose a bigger one to me. But yeah, I mean, the Urantia book is an epical event, we think, and comparable to the incarnation of Christ as an epical event. So this is the current epical revelation, as in Christ's visitation here was at the same status. Is it a blueprint of a meta-narrative? It is, but and a lot of Urantians don't like me to talk this way, but it's historically contingent text in that it uses human sources. I don't know, Ted, if you saw the appendix to my book where it talks about this issue, that what we call the revelators, the celestial authors, went out and read all the great works, like the Great Books program at Chicago. They read all the great works of our thinkers, with a strong bias to the West, by the way. And then they interspersed the best ideas from all of that discourse, all the way back, all over the centuries, into the text. And they used that as scaffolding around which they added enhancements. So the revelatory material is something you can tease out if you can identify the human source of particular ideas. And for example, you can see Luther in some of these discussions. And then you can see additions to Luther that are, if you know your Luther well, that are added by the revelatory authors. So they're not. That's why it should not be taken literal, because it's a creative reinterpretation of the best of human thought, purportedly, up until 1942 or so. So you can't in any way say this is a blueprint that would last forever, but it is heuristic. It's giving us a structure that we can work with, like a reference text that is a better reference text than the Bible. And I just adore the Bible. I love the Bible. I think it in a way reads better than the Urantia book. It's more heartfelt than the Urantia book by far, really. But it's to be considered as a guide for modern people, and it could be a guide for postmodern, a reference for the postmodern thinker to say, okay, this is the best we can get for modernism, which is a meta-narrative. It comes from celestial beings. We've been trying to kind of reinvent that as human theologians and philosophers, but now we get these celestials saying, well, here's a way to link science, philosophy, and religion as of mid-20th century. Here's a way to do it. So now you go and do it for the 21st century. And this will give you some methodology, and they have sections which are kind of methodology sections that I could point you to that kind of tell us how to relate science, philosophy, and religion, and revelation, actually, kind of a fourfold methodology. So they tell you kind of, here's the method. Now you go and do it. And that's really why I wanted to interview somebody like you to help Urantians see that there are people doing this currently, and we can do it too with our reference text. But we need to look back at the Bible and see how far we've come with that ancient text. We've come a long way, but how much further could we go with something like the Urantia book, which really connects a lot of dots that have never been connected? So there's my answer.
Well, let me ask you, Byron, if I were a Muslim, or one of your good friends is a Muslim, how would you compare and contrast your view of the Urantia Revelation with the way a Muslim thinks about the Quran? The Quran, for most Muslims, is actually dictated and hence literally and conceptually true as written, and that it's really not contextual. You don't need, I've been to meetings with Muslims where they don't like the word hermeneutics. There's no need to interpret.
Wow.
Because you just read it the way it's written. So, you've compared the Urantia to the Bible. Now compare Urantia to the Quran in the Muslim mind, and what's the same and what's different?
Well, yeah, I don't know quite enough about the Quran, but I can say a few things, which is epical revelation and personal revelation, or what they call auto revelations, revelation from within, to prophets, to poets, to philosophers. They're getting a stream of truth within them. And I think of Muhammad as that kind of revealer. So, it is dictated by him, through him, to those who were with him, who wrote it down, after all. And I don't think they didn't even codify the writings until correct me if I'm wrong, until the next generation. So it's not which is somewhat like the Bible, although that was several generations. So, I think of it as it's revelatory. I mean, but it's not epical in the sense that, having an incarnate Christ in your presence is unambiguously revelatory and is not symbolic. But, a text like that coming through somebody and then filtered through others who wrote it down can't be epical in that sense. And so the Urantia book has this crazy claim, really, to say, this is epical. This is the word for word. This is, and I was actually talking to Barbara Marx Hubbard today, who I know you know her work, and she's going to have me on her show to talk about this claim. And she was like, really? Do you really mean that? Do you really mean that the text of the Urantia book materialized, was not channeled? And yeah, I'm sorry, because that is the claim. And if you look at one of my appendices, it explains how that happened. And it sounds outrageous. But to get something that's epical, it has to have minimal human involvement. But it can't be uncontaminated by human involvement. And as I mentioned, there are the human authors that they acknowledge, and they state there are 2,000 separate ideas that they isolated from human authors and embedded. So it's a mix. It's a co-creative mix of human and divine. So anyway, it's a long-winded answer to your great question.
Well, this is a good time for long-winded answers. So I see one item in common and one item that distinguishes you from the Muslim. My Muslim colleagues liken the Quran not to the Bible, but rather to the incarnation in Jesus Christ. It's a material presence of the otherwise ineffable God.
Wow.
And I hear you saying something like that. Nevertheless, what would distinguish you from a Muslim's relationship to the Quran is that you're willing to grant contextualization. It's 1942. There are human ideas mixed in with divine ideas. And that's probably something our Muslim friends would not concede. Is that fair?
I think that's fair. And I think that's because the so-called revelators anticipated the postmodern trend, which is, that people recognizing interpretive, that interpretation will be a central issue in the postmodern world. And so they already allowed a deconstruction of the text by saying, well, this is not all revelatory word for word. And they state that, but a lot of Urantians are reluctant to admit that. So, I mean, I'm on the liberal end, just so you know. So if you run into other ones,
we like liberals in California.
Yeah, we're on the west bank here, so
on the left coast, yes.
Left coast, we permit that, and but it's just pretty tough to get around that one.
Right.
And to maintain fundamentalism in this world, it's just
people in our era, Byron, don't like us when we appeal to revelation because the modern and emerging postmodern culture is very egalitarian in character, and those who claim to be relying on special revelation appear to be pulling rank by appealing to authority and things like that. So it's a tough road to go. I mean, it's a road that both you and I are going down, even though perhaps the revelatory source might be different in each case.
Right. I think that's where comparing notes is something we can do for decades. In fact, that's why I'm telling you I'm going back to school, in theological school, to see how it's been done so well in the Christian tradition to uphold revelation in a postmodern world, and one that's kind of got to get a feel for that so it can translate into this work. But maybe we've definitely hit some high points here, Ted, on that, and maybe we can segue into these other topics that we talked about, because within this meta-narrative and this supposed revelation, is the human subjectivity, this human subject, and where do we place the human subject in this big picture? And your work is, you're kind of a pretty strong critic of these reductionists who are writing about the Big Bang cosmology and writing out the human subject. But you mentioned the soul, and where does the soul? What part what part of is, where does it stand in the big narrative, in the big picture? How do you understand the human soul in that big picture?
Well, I lift up the hypothesis that the depth of the human soul is actually a historical event. It occurred somewhere around 2,500 or 3,000 years ago in different parts of history, where God, the transcendent one, had a shocking impact on human consciousness, which forced human consciousness into an inner depth that it had not really undergone before. And that's one of the reasons why those of us who inherit the traditions of the higher religions, such as Hinduism and Buddhism, to some extent even Taoism and Confucianism, and then certainly what happened in Israel and Greece, that our access to transcendent and hence ultimate reality is through the soul and not through the material world that surrounds us. And I'm a little suspicious that our human ancestors prior to that axial moment probably didn't have souls, at least phenomenally speaking, in the same way that you and I do. And so in that sense, and I'm not sure I want to use your word evolving soul, but there's a certain sense in which your and my souls have a certain history, and I think you're going to probably agree with that. So that's the first point I make in terms of God and cosmic history. And frankly, I'm expecting more criticism than I've received for making that claim. Be that as it may, it's within that context then that we Christians want to talk about our relationship to God as gracious. We think that that's what we learned from the Christ event, and you certainly believe that divine grace is everywhere present if we'd only kind of wake up and pay attention to it. And I certainly think that that's what we've learned from at least the Christian version of the axial insight. I think, or at any rate, so my summary would be that the soul and the transcendent God come together in a single package. You get one, you get the other. And that's why in my book on Sin Boldly, I have this section on the broken soul, which happens frequently, I think, with our soldiers in combat, where suddenly in the face of an atrocity, what they lose first is a sense that cosmic justice, transcendental justice, will be exacted. And then they say, even if they're atheists, they say, that's when my soul left me. So I think that this relationship between God, who transcends the world, and your and my inner soul, they come together like twins, and you can't have one without the other. So that's Ted's view of the soul. And I'm kind of interested, Byron, in your view. You have this sort of tripartite understanding of the human. You've got what, the evolving soul, you've got the indwelling presence of the spirit, and then you've got the person. And I'm sort of intrigued with how you develop that, because as you talk about the evolving soul, boy, I think a lot about what a Buddhist would say. You know, the evolving soul in the material world of interaction and cause and effect sort of builds up karma. I don't know if you like the word karma or not, but it sort of builds up a special historicized identity. And then it can change over time. And here's my question for you is, why is person one of the three? I tend to think of person as the comprehensive idea, which would include the depth of our soul as well as the superficialities of our temporal interchange with the material world. So I'm going to ask you, who's doing the interview here? I'm interviewing you. So tell me, how is it that the evolving soul and the person...
Image there, see if it comes back. Okay, you cut out there. So, well, yeah, I'll tell you. Here we go. I mean, the personality concept is, in the Urantia book, is a pretty revelatory idea that I can't find other than the notion of the imago Dei in biblical thought, which when you look at that, it's not that well developed, I think, in biblical theology, what that really means, because it's a vague doctrine just right from the beginning. We don't learn much about what that means, but the image of God within us is translating the Urantia book into the actual unique self. It's the entity called the self is uniquely bestowed on the person at my view, at conception, or certainly at birth. But it's an entity that is not a space-time entity. It has one foot in space-time, and another foot is outside of space-time. So it's a bridge for us outside of time to the divine, and it's unchanging. And it brings with it free will. So the gift of and the mystery of free will is enabled by this entity, which is really what I think of as a fractal of divinity, of God's nature, of God's self. It fractalizes into each human being and gives them sacredness, because it confers on them the freedom of free will, and a second attribute, which is self-awareness. So the capacity to be self-aware has to be conferred upon us. And animals don't have self-awareness in this sense. So God's own self-awareness, which is in perfection, a perfect self-appraisal, that's a definition of deity, I guess, is conferred on us as a potential. So we can become more self-aware, through prayer, through worship, through meditation. We're becoming like God by becoming aware of our consciousness. So that's how I see it. And unique, paradoxically, it's an unchanging entity. So it is that which provides. It's like what you were saying. You think of it as inclusive of all the parts of the self, and I agree with that. But it's more like the host for the self that is transcends and includes all the aspects of the self: the mind, the body, the spirit, the soul, and including the spirit. So the spirit self is sub-absolute, or it's subordinate to selfhood. And spirit is given to us because it also comes from God, but it's a fragment of deity, and it doesn't have personality, and it wants to become one with our personhood. Does that make sense?
Excuse me. Actually, it does. I'm thinking here of Pope John Paul II and Cardinal Ratzinger, who became Benedict XVI. Both of these pontiffs would say that in conception, there are three forces at work: the genome of the father, the genome of the mother, and then God imparts a spiritual soul at that particular point. I thought maybe I heard you saying that your and my soul is actually bestowed upon us by God, and that it's not a natural product. And if I heard you right, is the soul a gift from God, and could God take it back if he doesn't think what we do with it?
Actually, I didn't. these terms, the soul is not bestowed. The soul is a later product of experience. But what is bestowed is the spirit. So there's what tends to happen in Christianity is spirit and soul are conflated, and need not be, because we have two different Greek terms for that, pneuma and psyche, right? So, but unfortunately in Paul and other places, it's not clearly distinguished. So you end up, and I have a couple of chapters on this in my book that takes you through this history of why we didn't have a strong distinction between soul and spirit. And we should, at least the Urantia book says we should, because the soul is the evolutionary product of experience, it's the product of our decisions, but the spirit is already fulfilled, complete in itself, and that's resident in us. And so there's a big second step in that, is that you've got this capacity to make decisions, human decisions, and have experience, and the spirit part of the self recognizes that and is the entity that memorializes those events in one's life. So so-called soul memories are created not by the soul itself. It doesn't do it itself. It's the spirit part of the self in this architecture that recognizes a worthy experience and hits the save button. It can be pretty ordinary things.
Yeah.
And so each of these are what I call soul making. So each event, and it's throughout the day, we have soul making experiences. But in order to have that architecture, you have to distinguish the soul, the evolving soul, from the spirit. And then there's a third part, which is the host of the whole system, of the self system, is this personhood, that is the container for this to occur in, that gives it coherence and unity. And so, this is, I spent really a couple decades on trying to tease out this language from the Urantia book and compare it, just beginning to compare it with Christian thought. And it's not easy to do, because you got to define all these terms.
I use almost the same vocabulary, but I mean slightly different, though overlapping things. When I use the word soul, psyche in Greek, you speak better Greek than I do, I mean that which is essentially you as an individual. When I use the word spirit, I think of the dimension of your and my inner life that is relational in character. So we can share in God's spirit, or we can share in a group spirit. So even though soul and spirit are related, like you, I distinguish them, but I distinguish them in a way that differs from yours. Personhood is where I locate this accumulation of experiences in history that eventually constitute our identity. I am much more reluctant than you are to say that the soul undergoes development or change or evolution or progress or something like that. And here's why. It's actually an ethical argument rather than an ontological argument. It goes like this. In our modern world, we have the doctrine of dignity. And I think it's maybe the most precious of the modern doctrines that we have. And it doesn't belong to any one religion. It belongs to secular society. But it means that we treat each individual person as a moral end and not as a means to something else. And so it's the ground, dignity is the ground for human rights and all kinds of things in law, etc. Now, the Roman Catholics and some others believe that dignity is grounded in the image of God in us, or, in slightly different vocabulary, the fact that we have a soul. The Quakers in the 18th century were buying slaves out of slavery and giving them freedom on the grounds that their souls were baptized and therefore of eternal value to God, and they should be liberated on that grounds. Let me just say, I want to own that particular history in which the soul becomes identified with human dignity and that which is essentially you. And that doesn't change. I don't want to say it's eternal like a rubber ball that bounces from this life into the next life, but I do want to say that the soul is what gives us our identity, even if our personhood changes over time, or if our spiritual relationships change over time. That soul perdures as the warrant that you and I be treated by others as a moral end, just as God, out of God's love, treats us as the beloved one. So I think you and I are kind of after a lot of the same things, but I put some of my concerns in slightly different categories than you do. So does this make sense, or what do you think?
Yeah, it makes sense, and it just makes me realize that the premises were changed for me from the Urantia Revelation because it went to great lengths to give us new definitions of familiar terms. I mean, soul is a familiar term to a Christian, but they have radically redefined it. So, it's, in a sense, you might say, well, that's an arbitrary thing. But these are revelators, so they're saying, look, we're here to straighten this out, and we're going to give you these distinctions that, but with all due respect, we're telling you that God cares about your experience. And it's not just an incidental, but the human experience is essential to the salvation history. And so much so that God has this entity inside of you that's monitoring your experience and hitting the save button every time it likes what it sees. And as you improve your decisions, you are contributing to the evolution of consciousness universe-wide, throughout the universe. You're contributing to the field, so-called, the sort of the morphic field of the universe, which is improving and perfecting itself. So what would be the mechanism to pool everyone's experience into this oversoul? And this is in process theology, I think, somewhat. And that we are contributing to this growth of collective soul. So in order to have that, you have to have an evolving soul. Something has to be evolving here, other than nature, other than biology. So that's what's evolving, and that's the preciousness of human decisions is enshrined in this idea of the soul as evolving and contingent on human decision. But it's co-created with this spirit self. And the spirit also not only catalyzes, and not only it's the save button, but it's catalyzing better choices. So it's guiding you from within, which gives me a little bridge to your work with justification by faith, I hope, because I really want to get into that, the core Lutheran doctrine that I think that you've not updated, but even a new modern, postmodern interpretation, that the Spirit of Christ enters into us and justifies us, that is, makes us whole, I guess, makes us one as a free gift, and we don't have to run around trying to fix ourselves. Is that generally in the ballpark?
Well, you're playing in the ballpark. I think you just hit a single. We still have to get around all the bases.
Okay.
And it is, as you suggest, quite relevant to our conversation a few moments ago, the Lutherans are only a small twig on the Latin branch of the tree of Christianity. But we do feel that God has given us a specific vocation, namely grace, 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 grace. It's our job to make sure that we never forget that God is gracious. So how does that apply here in St. Paul's understanding of justification by faith? And my answer, after looking at Martin Luther's interpretation of St. Paul, is that the Holy Spirit places the living Christ, actually the crucified and the resurrected Christ, in the believer, in the person of faith. And if you have to use the word mystic, well, I'm just going to have to, swallow it and say, okay, maybe it's mystical in character. But there is two of us right now. The old Adam and the new Adam, and new Adam in the New Testament means Jesus Christ. The icon tu theou, the image of God in Christ, according to St. Paul. And the Holy Spirit makes that Christ indwelling. And so, what St. Paul means and what the Lutherans mean when they say that you and I are justified by faith is that Christ is truly present. Christ has absorbed and taken on sin, suffering, and death, and then loans us, so to speak, life, forgiveness and resurrection into God's eternal life. And so that's an indwelling understanding of how justification works. Now, most of my Lutheran colleagues don't like me to talk this way because they prefer a forensic or legal model whereby the judge declares that the person being prosecuted is declared innocent even though he's guilty, he or she is guilty. They like that forensic model, but I think the indwelling model works better. And I have these friends that I've mentioned to you in other conversations in Helsinki and other places in Finland who have really been raking through these texts very carefully to see, and they are persuaded that the indwelling of Christ model better explicates what St. Paul says and what Martin Luther says and what you and I ought to believe is the way that God's grace works in the life of the sinful person who is justified before God despite the fact that we're sinful.
And it's indwelling. It's beautiful. Thank you, Ted, for going over that. It becomes indwelling because of our, and contingent on our faith in this message, in this hope. So it's not automatically granted to us without faith.
That is a controversial issue because if we formulate it the way you just did, then faith looks like another human work. Lutherans are really anti-Pelagian. They don't want any human achievement or merit associated with this. So that's a good way to, if you say that at a cocktail party, the Lutheran's going to say, excuse me, I got to go to the bathroom right now. Because that is a toughie, but there's no question that the Lutheran wants to avoid thinking that this faith, even in the form of the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, is a human achievement in character. But I think this is a point now where there might be both contact and dissonance between your view and the Lutheran view. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that your Urantian view is similar to the Gnostics. So the pneuma, the Spirit of God, was placed in you right from the beginning with that indwelling, and now your soul is growing and evolving and developing. I think the Lutheran wants to say that this indwelling of Christ is actually a historical event. It happens in time and place. And it's not there, so to speak, at conception or birth or something like that. Now, I'm going a little beyond where we normally are comfortable in these sorts of discussions into speculation, but I just like to see, do you think that's a fair comparison?
Yeah, it's fair, but with a lot of like footnotes here, because you should know that there's passages in part 4 of the Urantia book that sound like Luther, because if I understand Luther, because I was kind of stunned when I first saw this, because it looks like a direct quote, I think, where it says Jesus is saying. They have these discourses in part 4, which I hope you get a chance to look at some of them. They're lengthy and they're philosophic, and they're not entirely Gnostic. They sound like biblical Christianity. And anyway, he's saying your faith is also a gift. It isn't something you're doing through just willing it to be the case. It's a gift to you. And I went, wow, that really sounds biblical there, and they've got it right in there. So yet at the other side of this is that remember that, as I say in my book, that the spirit self does not enter at conception. It enters actually later on when the child has moral autonomy. So it's linked to the possibility of the free will of the child being activated to make choices among all options. Then it comes in around age 6. The universe notices that and sends the spirit into the child. So it's not, if a child doesn't get that to that place, they don't get a spirit, but almost all children do, unless they have a very defective brain and that sort of thing. So yeah, just to clarify these different definitions, if I may. But coming back around to the indwelling, so your understanding is that the Christ, the Spirit of Christ, is indwelling because of the Christ event, is granted to all of us as a free gift. Did I get that? Did I get that right?
Well, you're asking the right question, but this is another one that's going to send the Lutheran, to the bathroom to avoid it. The dominant view within our tradition is you've got the historical event of the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and this is followed then by the work of the Holy Spirit, who places that event in the person of faith, regardless of what century or where in geography he or she is. And it is, in a sense, a collapse of history, while at the same time it's distinctively historical in character. Now, there were some Lutherans in the late 19th century that hold a view a little bit closer, I think, to yours. And they argued that God is eternally gracious, and that God's decision for your and my salvation was made before the founding of the world. And therefore, when you and I have the Spirit, the Holy Spirit places the Christ within us, it is plugging us into an eternal, divine, gracious act, and is not, so to speak, contingent upon how historical events go. And those Lutherans were called liberal Protestants. Most Lutherans are not liberal in that score, but one of the knotty questions that we all our theologians need to keep asking is, well, where does God's saving work originate? In God as creator, or in God as redeemer? And is redeemer separate from creation, or was it built into creation? And let me just say, the theologians still have got a lot of homework to do on that. And it strikes me that the Gnostic view collapses everything into creation, and then redemption, or what appears to be redemption, is a gradual realizing of what was eternally true in creation in the first place. So there's a lot of continuity there in the sense that God is gracious throughout, but I have a hunch that your average Christian, and that includes the average Lutheran, is probably going to put a lot more weight on the redemption side of that teeter-totter.
So the redemption then referring to the historical event of Christ's incarnation.
Yes, that Christ actually does work for God in history.
Yeah.
And that this actually counts for eternity. And what do you think of that? Because it strikes me that in your view, that what counts is your and my soul evolution, so to speak, with regard to our terrestrial experiences in time and place. But the Christ event is not a hinge, so to speak, on which all of this swings in quite the way that it would be for your typical Christian.
Well, it gets you to the atonement doctrine, which is really, I think, the pivot point for the discussion, perhaps. And I'll tell you a little story. I was actually in Tampa recently, where I met a Urantia person who goes to a church with a pastor who renounced the atonement doctrine. And it was a non-denominational church. And so this guy saw this as an opening to go to the minister and say, "You must be reading the Urantia book, are you?" And the guy hadn't even heard of it.
Right.
So through his own intuition, he said, there's something wrong with this idea, this juridical, legalistic idea that God had to, sacrifice his only son in order to make this salvation event efficacious. And so what happened, by the way, is that the pastor kind of blessed this guy, and the two assistant pastors are fervent Urantia students at this church. This is kind of unprecedented, because they kind of, because the opening and the turning point was the atonement doctrine. And so, I have a critique of the atonement doctrine in my book that you've seen, and that I think that's why Lutherans and almost all Christians, with maybe an exception with Orthodox Christians, maybe, don't hang so much on the atonement as this source event for our salvation, but say it was already available and Christ came to renew it and to update the message, but not the juridical, forensic, whatever you were calling it before, a legal event that was not necessary, for history to move forward for our salvation. So I guess that is the answer. And would you say, it seems to me that the atonement doctrine was strengthened by the Protestants. Am I right? It was emphasized even more with Calvin and probably Luther.
Well, I appreciate the clarity with which you're formulating the issues and your reiteration of the Urantian position, which gives you a larger fraternity with liberal Protestants than maybe you wanted to admit. I think I want to say two things about atonement. First is just in general, the notion of atonement says that Jesus Christ did some actual work, effected something in God's relationship to the world. He didn't just reveal what was always true, but he actually made a change. So I think in general, that's the point of atonement, is that there's a historical impact on God's relationship to the world that happens in Jesus Christ. What you're calling the atonement doctrine is actually one of what I call 6 different models. I've gone through the New Testament asking the question, how does Jesus save? And the New Testament doesn't have just one answer. It's got about 6 different ones. And one of them, I think, is what you're calling the atonement doctrine, the hilasteron, if I pronounce my Greek right. Maybe you're biting your tongue every time I say a Greek word because I get the pronunciation wrong. But the hilasteron, which is the blood atonement, as if there is some sort of sacrificial mechanism whereby if we shed blood, then God responds by granting the wishes of the sacrificers. Does that image appear there in the New Testament? Well, yeah, here and there. And that's the one. And you'd mentioned, did the Protestants make the matter worse? Well, certainly John Calvin seemed to have, with his substitutionary atonement doctrine, whereby Christ becomes our sacrifice as a substitute for the sacrifice that we should have been making. And that presupposes a world in which sacrifice is a mechanism that changes reality. I happen to not believe that.
Okay.
And so I don't believe that so-called version of the atonement doctrine. But there are a number of other images in the Bible. One is Christ the victor. If you take a look at the book of Revelation, atonement is described as Saint Michael and all angels going into battle with the great dragon, Satan, and winning this victory. And so when God raises Jesus from the dead on Easter, it's like defeating death in a battle. And you've got your Greek Orthodox tradition. Isn't there a part of your liturgy where you stomp your feet and you beat down death and the devil? And so that's also an understanding of atonement that's parallel to, but quite different from, this notion of blood sacrifice, and on down the list. And there is one, especially in the Gospel of John, that should fit Urantia and should fit the liberal Protestant view, and that is that Jesus reveals what is eternally true about God in terms of God's redemptive grace. So what I want to do, again, as I said earlier, is treat the New Testament as a symbolic text that has all of these different metaphors, the basic point of which is that God acted in history in Jesus Christ. But how we understand the efficacy of that divine act, well, there are at least 3, I say a half dozen different models for doing that. And the semi-Gnostic model, well, that's there in the Gospel of John. So I don't want to rule it out entirely. So it just may be, at the end of the day, that Christ is a revealer of what has always been true.
At the end of the day, or the end of the era, or both.
Or when we
the end of the discussion.
Darkly, yeah.
We've really come a long way in this discussion, which has been just so rich. And I'm now speaking to Alex, our technical director. Alex, can we enable people to send? Oh no, here is one. I'm sorry. So Ted, I do have one from Don Beauchamp, and it says it looks oh there's many here, and I'm so sorry everybody, I'm missing them because I wasn't looking the right place. These are not questions, they're comments. Here's one from Jeff Taylor. It says the Urantia book was written by a variety of authors, each with different levels of understanding, and our faith in it, as Ted says, needs intellectual understanding. So that's a comment. Thank you, Jeff. There's another from Don. It says, would postmodern academia now balk at parsing and deconstructing the foreword of the Urantia book for theological research purposes? He wants me to answer the questions. Yeah, I can't follow that. So sorry. See, there's another person. It's all two guys here, and there's many comments. Here's a question from Jeff Taylor. How does the church reconcile the eternity of God with the 6,000-year-old Earth the literal Bible, or the scientific Big Bang? So it just is asking you to say something about Big Bang cosmology, and since that is an area that you've written about extensively, maybe we should just get into that a little bit and talk a little bit more about big history and compare notes on that with the Urantia book and your view, if you'd like.
Well, there is no the church who is in the business of reconciling the understanding of God's eternity with a 6,000-year-old history of planet Earth. There are a variety of different ways in which various Christian groups and Muslim groups, by the way, try to reconcile the discussion of biological evolution with religious belief. And if you're going to believe in evolution, especially macroevolution, you have to have deep time. You got to have billions of years if you're going to make this work. And the standard view right now is that planet Earth is 4.5 billion years old. Life began perhaps 2.8 or 2.9 billion years ago, evolved very slowly at first, and then accelerated before the life forms that you and I witness on a day-to-day basis finally arrived on the historical scene. The scientific creationists want to argue that between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago, God created all the life forms as we see them today. Now, it's got nothing to do with eternity. It just is a way of saying that life did not evolve from one species to another, but each kind of life was created, as Genesis says in Genesis 1:1-2:4a, all at once at the beginning. That's really a minority view. Clearly the dominant view in the Western Latin tradition, that's both Roman Catholics and most Protestants, is that the book of Genesis is not a calendar. It certainly tells us that God is the author of all living things, but the idea that things, species, not things, but species could evolve over time, well, it just doesn't seem to be a problem or a conflict there for most religious people. A lot of the creationists, by the way, and the intelligent design advocates, both in Western countries and in Turkey, are very concerned about what they think of as the oppression of the public school system, which is forcing a materialism down the throats of the children, and that evolution is a form of that. So each one of us has to decide, is evolutionary theory good science or not? And should our children be compelled to learn evolutionary theory? I think the answer is yes. I think they should be compelled to learn it. But at the same time, there is as much a political and social debate as there is an actual theological debate that's going on.
In this connection, Ted, thank you for that summary. I appreciate it a lot. What we talked earlier offline about the Urantia view that the Big Bang has to have something behind it. It's not just a Urantia view, but how they solve that question by stating that there is an eternal existence of a mother universe that was the source universe for the bang. Actually, there are multiple bangs, you might say, in the Urantia view, not one bang. But it is, without a doubt, an evolutionary cosmology in the Urantia book. How do you regard the notion of a mother universe? In other words, God not alone as the author of the Big Bang, but a domain, if you will, of being things and beings that are eternal, that are the source domain of space-time universes. How does that strike you?
Well, there are two questions there, and I think the first one is whether there's one universe or many, and then the second one is whether God is alone or has a company of co-creators. On the first one, in my book, God in Cosmic History, I really try to engage those physical cosmologists who are debating the anthropic principle having to do with our Big Bang and who set the initial conditions that made it possible that the expanding cosmos would eventually lead to the evolution of life and the arrival of Byron and Ted here in cosmic history. And it's just a mystery amongst the physical cosmologists themselves in trying to determine who set those initial parameters. Well, I argue in the book that the asking of that question is the asking of the God question. Now, I have opponents, those who really think that my argument is wrong, and they want to argue that the Big Bang is nothing special. The initial conditions of the Big Bang is nothing special. Why? Because there are many universes. In fact, every potential universe has been actualized, and you can do that either temporally or spatially. As I say, spatially, you could say there's this very large number of contiguous universes, each one with a different set of initial conditions. Or over time, you could say that you got a Big Bang, which is then followed by another Big Bang, and then followed by another Big Bang. And the reason you and I can't see them all is that they're temporally too far distant, too many light years away, that there's no way we can perceive them. Now, I argue in the book, and it's a hypothesis, that those people who disagree with me are not being scientific because they are exacting a materialist ideology and trying to support the idea of many universes over against one. And I'll have to say some of my good friends think that Ted is full of hooey here, but now this turns then to the Urantia worldview or meta-narrative, because among those physical cosmologists who hold for the many universe theory, we have some pretty good thinkers, you know, Stephen Hawking and Paul Davies and some others who think it's really scientifically reasonable to have multiple universes, of which our Big Bang universe is only one. Well, it would strike me that you and the Urantia cosmos would find some simpatico relationship with the multi-universe or multiverse theory. Now, if I understand the Urantian position, is that these various universes come in a sequence, right, one after the other. And let me just say, there are some scientists who actually see it that way. I happen not to think that, but on the other hand, I don't have decisive evidence to prove it either right or wrong.
No, I wouldn't say that that the Urantia book speaks of sequential whole universes. Rather, there is an always existing eternal central universe. So it's really a center and periphery kind of model. So the center has always been there, but the periphery has not always been there. So they actually give a date for the space-time universe coming into being, which is close to 1 trillion years. So it's way off, way different. Yeah, but it is created, and it is sourced from this central place, and so there's no multiple universes in there in that sense. But there is an always already existing universe, and but it needs space-time in an important way.
Well, if I could, in layman's term, enunciate Stephen Hawking's view, there is eternally quantum activity, subatomic activity, and then from time to time, it takes the form of one universe or another. So, maybe you should send Stephen a copy of the Urantia book and tell him he can footnote this in this next television show.
You have another question?
Yeah, well, I've got one for you, and that is, why is this eternal universe at the center? Why do you call that paradise?
I'm going to answer that, but Alec, did you just say that somebody had a question for us?
That's right. From Don Beauchamp. It's at the bottom of the list.
Yeah, let me hold that to the end. That's about extraterrestrial life. So let's get to that. It's a nice way to end. But let me get back to Ted's last statement about why do we use the term paradise? And I think it's one of their rare concessions to symbolic thought, and it's pretty rare. The Urantia book is not poetic particularly at all, and not prone to give you symbols, but they're taking this human idea of this perfect, heavenly realm, and then filling it in, with vast descriptions that are very satisfying to me, because, Ted, we have this notion of the one God, and then the Trinitarian, theology of the Urantia book, which I really encourage you to look at some more, because it's a communitarian view, which states that, because of God's relationality, you get the three in one, but then you get an expansion into a seven, so the permutation of 3 into 7, and so then from the seven facets of deity, they are the kind of the linchpins of space and time. So so the expression of deity now bursts into space-time, into 7 inhabited domains. They're not separate universes. They're space-time universes. They're actually, in my view, they're galaxy clusters. And remember, yesterday we were talking about, or last time we talked about this, that there were inhabited galaxies and non-inhabited galaxies. And so all of this is an expression of the Trinity through this habit with evolutionary beings who were coming back to paradise. So it comes out from paradise in this sort of dance. It's coming out into space-time, and then space-time is coming back into eternity. So there's a synthesis of the eternal and the temporal that is reached in far distant time when we move toward paradise and actually enter into this eternal universe, which is populated by eternal beings. And we dialogue with these eternal beings that are non-experiential, and we reveal to them what it's like to have experience. And so there's a synthesis of these types of beings that happens, which is part of the divine plan. But then there's further stages beyond that are these other great ages of the universe. And the next age is when we are sent back out into space-time, and beyond that into the uninhabited galaxies. So the uninhabited galaxies will be peopled, populated, and we will be their sort of deities. And there's a notion like this in Mormonism, very rough, that's similar but pretty different, that we have this eternal destiny and eternal life once we're perfected when we enter into paradise, because once we get there, we've perfected the self. So then we're deified. Yeah, so that's the purpose of paradise, is it's the place you go for deification. That old Greek doctrine of deification is made possible in paradise. So there's a long-winded answer.
That's just the answer I was looking for. By the way, I did read the Urantia book, and I underlined and made marginal notes, but it was a few years ago, and I was unable to find it before our conversation today. So I'm wondering if we could get an extraterrestrial to poke around my office and see if we can dig it up before we talk again.
Well, maybe we should end with a little talk about the ETs, because we do have a question. What do both Byron and Ted think about the revelation of our brothers and sisters from other worlds, all part of the enhancing human family of us mortals? So in other words, just on a little bit more humorous note, do you think of extraterrestrials as being present around the Earth and trying to reach us?
I have two different ways of looking at it. I go to barbecues with UFO experiencers, and I also go to barbecues with astrobiologists, and those two groups never go to the same barbecue. Right. They don't like each other, and they certainly think differently. And certainly the astrobiologists, who are kind of your hard-nosed materialists, sometimes reductionists, are going to think that extraterrestrial intelligent creatures are either going to be biological like us, or so highly evolved that it's machine intelligence in one character, another, one form or another, and that because of the light year problem, they're so far away, we're never going to have a covered dish dinner in which they're going to be our guests. The UFO people, however, are quite confident that some aliens have been visiting us in flying saucers and other spaceships, and some of those think that the aliens are spiritually present with us. I talked with one UFO experiencer who said he had an alien living within his mind right along with himself. So I tend not to go that route myself, nor do I advance the view that when you and I die, we're going to get reincarnated on another planet. Let me just say, I haven't gone there. Not that it's impossible, but I just don't see any empirical evidence or even rational evidence for going that route. So I tend to side a little bit with those austere astrobiologists.
I see. So in regard to heavenly life, is that what you were saying? That, or did you mean reincarnation? that you're not?
Oh, no, I was thinking of reincarnation, which is part of the belief system of some UFO experiencers.
Right. And just in conclusion, Ted, is it your view that there is an eternal life, that there is a heavenly life?
Yes, yes, definitely. And resurrection is the door that opens it.
Yeah. Well, I think on that we're very simpatico. And so
Byron, we get along. We get along.
We get along anyway, regardless. And I've just been discussion. Thank you so much, Ted.
Well, good talking with you.
And we'll keep it up.
All right.
Thanks for
Best
being
wishes. Best wishes.
Same to you. God bless you.
God bless.